He knelt at the foot of the gate with his palms turned up, and the silver garden had gone red around him, the flowers heavy enough to bend their own stems, the light off the petals the color of the inside of a wound.
Confess with your mouth, not your hands.
I had spent 20 years being dressed by him, brushed by him, tied at the throat by him. I had walked past him 1,000 times without looking. I had been told as a child that nothing reached me without passing him first, and I had decided at 7 that the sentence was a promise. I am no longer 7. I have found a journal in a chapel the servants will not enter. I have found my own name in his hand, written in years I cannot remember living through. I have found the bruise of his fingers around my wrist after a night I cannot account for, and a wax eye on the brass dish where my candle used to burn, and a stained glass window of women who are not angels. I am going to ask him a question in that red garden, on his knees, with my hand in his hair. I am not sure yet which of us the answer will ruin. Chapter 1. The Boy in the Rain. I was 7 years old when I learned what obedience could look like, and I have never quite stopped looking at it. It was raining the way it rains in early autumn at Lorifet, slow, gray, patient, the kind of rain that does not stop because it has nowhere else to be. I had been kept indoors that day for some small offense I cannot remember. A wrong fork at supper. A failed curtsy. My governess had told me a lady did not stamp her foot. I had stamped my foot. I had been put to bed without a meal, and a candle had been lit beside my pillow because I would not sleep in the dark. I have never been able to sleep in the dark. That night I told the boy who had been assigned to me, a quiet child of my age in a coat too large for him, with muddy brown hair he had to keep brushing out of his eyes, that he was to stand in the courtyard until I said otherwise. I did not say all night. I said until I say otherwise. I meant it for an hour, maybe less. I wanted to see if he would do it. I wanted to see if anything in my house could be made to obey me. He went. He did not argue. He went down the back stairs in his too large coat, and he stood in the rain. I forgot him. I was a child. I was hungry. I crawled under the blanket and watched the candle and fell asleep without meaning to. When I woke at dawn, I went to the window because I always went to the window. I did not remember what I was looking for. The garden below was gray with mist, and the hedges had gone black with water, and at the edge of the gravel path, in the same place where I had left him, the boy was still standing. His coat was so soaked it had stopped shedding water. His hair lay flat against his forehead. His lips were blue. His hands hung at his sides, open, not fisted against the cold. He was looking up at my window the way a sundial looks at the sun, patient, oriented, indifferent to weather. When he saw me, he smiled. That was the part that stayed with me, not the blue lips, not the hours, the smile, as if the rain had been nothing and the cold had been nothing, and the only thing that had ever been something was the fact that I had finally come to the window. I remember running. I remember the housekeeper's voice when she found him, and the porcelain bowl of water heated by the kitchen fire, and the strangeness of his calm, while a woman 3 times his age muttered every saint she knew over him. I remember kneeling in front of him on the kitchen flagstones, my own hair in my mouth, asking him over and over to forgive me. And I remember the steady, almost adult way his eyes had found my face. He had said,
"Nothing reaches you without passing me first."
I was 7. He was 7. His voice was already older than his mouth. I have spent the years since trying to decide whether that sentence was a promise or a warning. I am 27 years old now. I sleep with a candle lit on the table beside the bed. I have done this for as long as I can remember, and no one has been able to explain it to me, including the tutors who disapproved and the herbalist who offered tonics. I only know that when the candle goes out, the dark feels like a room with someone in it, and I would rather not test whether the someone is waiting or already arrived. I have worn a locket since I was 12, when my grandmother put it around my neck and closed the clasp with both her hands as though she were arming me. I have not looked closely at the clasp. I do not have a reason. I forget that the locket is there for whole days at a time. It is a small silver weight at the hollow of my throat, and it is the oldest unbroken thing I own. My servant, the boy from the rain, grown into a man who has not visibly aged in 20 years, is the second. He brings my tea before I ring. He knows which side of the bed I prefer and which dress makes my father shout less. He ties my ribbon at the throat when I have left it crooked, and he has never once told me that he can see I leave it crooked on purpose. He is the first face I see in the morning. He has watched me become whatever I have become. I have never told him any of these preferences. He has always known. I have only watched the bodies. Chapter 2. The Silver Garden. The dreams began the year I turned 19. I had been kept busy that spring. There had been a betrothal portrait commissioned for a man I had not yet been allowed to meet, and the painter had insisted I hold a lily, and I had sat for him 3 afternoons in a row with my back so straight my ribs ached. The lily had wilted by the second sitting. The painter had painted it fresh. On the night the portrait was sent away in its varnished crate, I lay down in my bed with my candle lit and my hair unbraided, and I dreamed of a garden I had never seen. It was silver, that is the simplest way to say it, and I have never found a better one. The grass under my feet had the quality of cold metal. The air tasted of cold metal. There were flowers I did not have names for, wide, pale things on tall stems, with petals that caught light I could not find the source of, and they grew along a path that led to a wrought iron gate. Above the gate, set into the iron in a pattern I did not look at long enough to memorize, there was a closed eye ringed by thorns. Fear did not come. That was the first thing I noticed after the cold and the silver. Every other place I had ever been alone had frightened me. Here, the fear stayed outside the gate. That was when he stepped onto the path. He looked like Silas, my servant, the boy from the rain. He had the same muddy brown hair, the same ocean blue eyes, the same way of standing so still it was a kind of action. But he was not in livery. He wore something close to a shirt, open at the throat, sleeves loose, and his hands were ungloved, and his hands were the part I could not look away from. I had never seen his hands. He came to me, and he did not bow. That, more than the silver, more than the gate, was what marked the dream as a violation of every rule the world I lived in had taught me. He did not bow. He stood in front of me at the height he stood, which was a little taller than my brow, and he looked into my face the way a man looks at a woman who has not been promised to anyone else.
Rank is a costume. You can take it off here.
He took off my gloves. I want to be very precise about this because it matters later. He did not pull them off. He took them finger by finger, the way one untangles a thread, and when each finger was bare, he kissed the place where the seam had been, the inside of the wrist, the second knuckle, the soft pad below the thumb. He did not move quickly. He waited between each kiss to see whether I would withdraw. I did not withdraw. Me, with his mouth against my palm, whether I wanted to be obeyed or known. I tried to answer. I could not find the shape of the answer. He lifted his head and watched me try. He was patient about it in a way no one had ever been patient about anything I was doing.
Tell me one thing you have never told anyone.
I told him. I will not write it here. It was small and old, and the kind of thing a child confesses to a wall when there is no one else listening. He took it from me the way he had taken the gloves, slowly, finger by finger, until I no longer had it. I woke with my hand pressed over my own mouth and my nightdress twisted around my hips, and the candle on the bedside table had burned down to a soft puddle and was guttering against the brass. The window was gray. My heart was so loud I thought it would bring the household. I lay very still. I counted to 30. I counted to 100. When I rose, finally, and went to the basin to wash my face, I caught my own reflection in the mirror and could not hold my own eye. I had wanted him. I had wanted him in a way I had no architecture to contain. I had wanted him, and his face was the face of the man who would bring my tea in 3/4 of an hour. He did bring my tea in 3/4 of an hour. He brought it on the tray with the small chip on the rim, the one I preferred, and he set out my morning gown, pale blue, the one with the high collar, without consulting me. He noticed that I had not tied the ribbon at my throat. He stepped close, his gloved hand steady, and tied it for me without asking. His knuckles brushed the underside of my jaw. I felt it as if he had pressed his bare palm to the place where his mouth had been in the dream. I could not meet his eyes in the mirror.
Will there be anything else, my lady?
I shook my head. I did not trust my voice. He left. I sat down on the edge of the bed for a long time before I could rise to dress. Beneath the pillow, when I reached without thinking to flatten the cool linen, my fingers closed on something thin and cold. I drew it out into the light, a single petal, silver, the color and the temperature of the flowers I had walked among an hour ago, in a place that did not exist. I held it on my palm. It did not melt or warm or do any of the small, reasonable things a piece of jewelry would do. It lay there cold, and after a moment I closed my fingers over it and walked to my jewelry box and put it under the velvet lining where my grandmother's brooches had always been. I decided it had fallen from a brooch I did not remember owning. I decided it fiercely because there was no version of my morning in which I could afford any other explanation, and because the bell was ringing for prayers, and because Silas was already waiting in the corridor with my prayer book in his gloved hand, and because I needed to walk past him without my knees buckling. I did walk past him. That was the first day I understood that there was a place I could go where I felt held, and that I was going to begin dreading waking, not because my life was unbearable, but because waking meant leaving. I had not used the word love yet, even in my own head. I would not for almost a year. But I had begun to know the shape of it, the way one knows the shape of a room, by feeling the wall in the dark, and the shape was already too large for any door in my father's house. Chapter 3. The Betrothal and the Blow. My father did not tell me about the engagement. He announced it. We were at table. There were 16 people present, including the heir of the rival house and his mother, who watched me eat the way a buyer watches a horse pick up its feet. My father stood, tapped the head of his cane twice against the floor, the small punctuation that meant he had decided, and announced that I would marry Killian Croilieu in the spring. Killian was across the table from me. He smiled with the side of his mouth. He had a beauty mark near it, and the smile pulled the mark up like a small dark seal.
I hope that you will not be the kind of woman who asks questions.
His mother laughed at that, low and pleased. Killian turned the laugh in his hands like he had earned it. He looked at me longer than was civil. He looked at me the way a man looks at a cup he intends to drink from later. I felt Silas at the wall behind me. He did not move. He never moved when there was anyone else in the room. He was scenery. He was the silver pitcher and the candle sconces and the embroidered fire screen. He was nothing. I felt him as if he were pressed against my back. I drank my wine. I smiled the smile I had been trained to smile when men spoke to me of my future. The mother of the rival house nodded once, as if I had passed an inspection. My father did not look at me at all. That night in my chamber, I told Silas that I did not want this marriage. He had been laying out my brushes. His hands paused. He looked at me, not at my reflection, for the second time in his service. The first had been in the kitchen, when I was 7 and kneeling on the flagstones. The second was that night, beneath the cuff of his sleeve, when he turned his wrist to set down the brush. I saw a thin line of silver, faint as moonlight on water, that did not belong on a man's skin. He drew the cuff down without looking at it.
Then you will not have it.
I should have asked him what he meant. I did not. I should have asked him what he was capable of. I did not. I took my hair out of its twist. I let him brush it. I closed my eyes when his hand passed near the nape of my neck, and I told myself it was tiredness, and he brushed my hair until the candle burned low. 3 days later, an anonymous letter surfaced in the gossip rooms of court. It named Killian Croilieu's mistress. It named the inn. It named the child. It named the night of the most recent rendezvous, and the kind of cake that had been ordered from the kitchen, and the color of the ribbon the mistress had worn in her hair. By the time my father had finished reading it, the engagement was over. By the time the engagement was over, my father was in my chamber with his glove already off. I kept my face turned toward him. I have never given him that. He struck me high on the cheekbone, on the faint reddish mark I have powdered since I was a girl, the place where, if I tell the truth, he has struck me before. My lips split against my teeth. I tasted blood. My hands stayed in my lap. My voice stayed buried. He left. The door had not yet swung closed when Silas was in the room. I do not remember calling him. I never remember calling him. He came to me, knelt at my feet, took the corner of his own sleeve in his gloved hand, and pressed it to my mouth. He had to lift my chin to do it, and his fingers stayed a moment too long on my jaw, light as breath. I felt him notice the mark on my cheekbone, the older one, the one my father had reopened, and I felt him decide not to say anything about it. He cleaned the blood from my lip. He did not look at me with pity. That was the part I remember. He looked at me the way one looks at a thing one is going to do something about.
Do you want him punished?
I should have said no. I should have said you will do nothing, nothing. The silence sat between us. He waited inside it. He gave me long enough to refuse him. He gave me long enough that my not refusing became its own sentence, spoken in my voice, in my own room, with my own lip bleeding into his sleeve. He lowered his eyes.
Then I will only make certain he cannot touch you again.
He stepped back. He stood. He inclined his head as he always inclined his head before leaving the room. I watched him go. His shoulders were steady. His hands, even with my blood on his sleeve, were clean. The questions sat in me untouched. How the letter had been written, who had carried it to court, what he meant by touch. I sat in my chair until the candle guttered. I knew then, in some part of me I have never managed to lock, that I was not asking because I was afraid of the answer. I was more afraid that the answer would not stop me from being grateful. Chapter 4. Blackwater. Killian Croilieu fell ill 2 days later. He complained, his attendants told the court, of black water in his mouth, that he could not stop tasting it, that he spit, and the taste returned. By the 4th day he was bedridden. By the 6th he was dead. The court physicians murmured of fever. His mother, in her grief, screamed of poison and was led away. I went to the funeral in a high-collared gown the color of dusk. Silas stood 3 paces behind me at the chapel, where servants were permitted to stand. I did not look at him. I did not need to. I felt him the way one feels the weather one is walking through. In the coffin, Killian was beautiful. They had brushed his hair back from his face the way he had worn it in life, and the beauty mark by his mouth had been left visible. His lips were a strange gray. I stood by the open coffin for the time it took to be considered respectful. Beneath my ribs, something small and clean loosened. I waited for horror to come. What came instead was the easing of a held breath. I have not been able to forgive myself for that breath. I keep returning to it the way one returns to a scar, to see whether it has finally stopped being tender. That night, Silas brought me tea I had not ordered. He set it on the table beside my bed. He did not look at the bed. He never looks at the bed. When he leaned down to set the cup, the pulse in the side of his throat moved against the high collar of his livery. Slow, then slow again, slower than a heart should be when it is bent close to a woman's face.
You can sleep now. He cannot reach you.
I noticed the word, reach, not marry, not trouble you, not take you from this house, reach. As if Killian had been a hand extended toward me, and the hand had been cut off at the wrist, I did not drink the tea.
Silas.
He paused at the door. He turned, but only slightly, only enough to indicate that he had heard me.
Don't say sleep to me like it's a kindness.
He did not answer. He inclined his head. He left. I drank the tea. I do not know why I drank the tea. I drank it, and I lay down, and I closed my eyes, and I dreamed of Killian Croilieu, drowning in a canal that was black, and on the bank stood a figure in a long coat watching, and the figure did not move, and I could not see the face. I woke at 3 a.m. to find that the candle had burned all the way down. The wax had pooled on the brass dish in a shape I could not, for the first long moment, account for. It was an eye, closed, lidded, almost peaceful. A thin ridge of wax made a ring of small thorns around it. I touched it before I had thought what I was doing. The wax was still warm. The shape did not smear. It had set as if it had been molded. The door opened. The bell rope hung untouched. My throat had made no sound. The door opened, and Silas stepped in as if he had been waiting in the corridor for me to wake, and the look on his face was not the look he wore at any other hour. He saw me sitting up. He saw my hand near the candle. He stopped.
Do you watch me even when I sleep?
I would never leave you unguarded.
Does guarding me include standing outside my door while I dream of you?
He did not answer.
Does it include enjoying what I cannot bring myself to say while I am awake?
He looked at me. He did not lower his eyes.
I enjoy surviving it.
The heat came up through me before the anger could find it. I felt it in the back of my throat, in my hairline, in the soles of my feet. I sat in the warm pool of it and could not look at him. He waited. He did not move from the doorway. After a long time, I said,
Leave me.
He left. I rose. I took the wax eye in my hand. It had cooled enough to lift cleanly off the brass. I opened the drawer of my nightstand, and I put the eye into the drawer, and I closed it, and I turned the small key. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hand on the locked drawer until the sky began to gray, and I did not lie down again. Chapter 5. The Thread and the Ribbon. I began to test him. I do not remember deciding to. I remember the first small action. A length of white thread laid across the threshold of my chamber when I went to dinner, so fine I had to crouch to set it. I remember coming back hours later and finding the thread broken. I remember telling myself servants come and go from rooms. That is what they do. That is what they are for. I laid the thread again. I laid it the next night and the next. I tied it to the lower hinge with a knot only I could see. The thread broke. The thread broke. The thread broke. I left a note in a drawer I did not use, addressed to no one. I wrote on the note, I know. I folded it twice and tucked it under a glove I did not wear. When I returned, the note was folded 3 times. He had read it. He had folded it again. He had not been able to make himself put it back wrong. 2 nights later, I set a sharper trap. I placed a small ivory comb at a deliberate angle on my vanity, handle to the east, 4 fingers from the candlestick, and I asked him, over a meaningless errand the next morning, to fetch a comb from my bedside, knowing the one he would bring me would prove whether he had stood beside the bed in the night or whether he had not. He brought me the bedside comb. The ivory comb on the vanity had moved 1/2 inch west. He had touched it. He had set it back. He had not set it back precisely. The error was so small it was almost a confession. I did not confront him. Instead, I began to watch his hands. I had been watching them already, but now I watched them with a discipline. When he reached for the collar of my morning gown to settle it across my shoulders, his hand paused. It paused for half a breath. He did not look at the collar. He looked at the line of my throat just below the locket, and he closed his hand against the impulse of his own fingers, and only then did he touch the fabric. In the silver garden, in the dream I'd had 3 nights before, his mouth had been at that exact place on my throat. I knew, watching his hand pause, that he knew exactly where his mouth had been. Him that afternoon, while he was setting out my prayer book and my second pair of gloves, whether he had ever heard of silver flowers, the kind that did not exist in any garden, that grew in old stories, that one read about as a child and did not believe in. He set the prayer book on the table. He set the gloves beside it. He paused. 1 breath. Then,
Silver flowers exist only in old fay stories, my lady, most of which are not fit for a noblewoman's reading.
he did not pause when he said Faye. He paused before he answered at all. That night, at the threshold of my door, before he left, I said his name. He turned. I asked him, casually, as if I were asking after the weather, whether he dreamed. His eyes met mine across the room. There was a flicker in them I had never seen and could not name.
Only of you.
The answer balanced between confession and warning. It might have been courtier's flattery. It might have been the plainest truth he had ever offered me. I think now he wanted it balanced there. He wanted me to sit with the sentence until decision itself turned useless, and then to find that I had stopped sleeping until I did. I lay awake the rest of the night. The candle stayed lit. The locket lay cold against my collarbone. I held it without realizing, the way I always do, and only when the sky paled did I notice my fingers were on the small silver clasp at the back, and that I had not, in 15 years, ever looked at it. I turned the locket in my fingers. The clasp faced the pillow. I did not turn it further. Chapter 6. What he wrote while I slept. I did not sleep cleanly the night after he said, "Only of you." I dreamed of the silver garden again. It was at its most beautiful. The pale, wide flowers stood at twice my height in places, and the light caught their petals from beneath, as if it were rising up out of the soil instead of falling from any sky. The path was longer than it had been before. The wrought iron gate stood open. He was waiting on the other side. He was not in livery. He was in the loose shirt again, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and the silver markings along his wrists were vivid this time, not faint. They ran in a fine pattern up the inside of his arm and disappeared under the cuff of the rolled sleeve, and I understood, looking at them, that I had been seeing them my whole life through clothes and not knowing what I was failing to see. He came to me, and he did not bow. He took my hand. He pressed the inside of my wrist against his mouth. Not a kiss, a slow press, as if he were listening for something through the skin.
Tell me what you would not be allowed to want. Here, it does not cost you.
I told him, I will not write that here either. Some of it was the things a woman cannot say in a corridor. Some of it was small, the colors I would have chosen for a wedding dress if it had been mine to choose. Some of it was a name I had been told as a girl not to say. He listened without laughter, without that particular smile a man wears when a woman gives him a thing he can use. His hand stayed at my wrist, and once, he turned his face away from me briefly and lifted his other hand into the air between us, making a small, careful gesture, as if he were smoothing a wrinkle out of a piece of linen no one else could see. I did not understand what he had done. He turned back to me. He drew me closer. He laid the flat of his palm at the side of my throat, beneath the place where the locket would have been if I had been wearing it. The locket was not there. In the dream, I had never worn it.
You will not remember this part. You will only remember the wanting.
I tried to ask him what he meant. The flowers above us began to release their pale light into the air, and the light came down between us like slow snow, and his palm was warm at my throat, and the question went out of my mouth before I had finished forming it. I woke at dawn with the taste of cold metal at the back of my tongue. I sat up. The candle on the nightstand was a stub. My hair, when I gathered it over my shoulder, smelled of something that was not the lavender of my linen press. It smelled of cold air and water on stone. The window was still latched. The outside had no honest way into the room. In the soft pad of my left palm, when I uncurled my fingers, there was a single fine prick of blood. No thorn, no splinter, just the puncture, perfectly round, as if a needle had passed through me in a place that did not exist. I closed my hand around it. I rose. I went to the basin. I washed my hair before he could come up with the tea. I scrubbed at the smell until my scalp ached, and even then, when I bent to towel it dry, the cold metal air of a garden I had not visited was still in the strands at my temples, faint as a memory I could not place. Silas brought my tea at the usual hour. He set it on the table. He looked at my hair, once, briefly, the way a man looks at a thing he has caused, and looked away. I noticed. He did not stay. He did not need to. He had stayed all night. Chapter 7. The Woman Beneath the Balcony. There was a woman at court named Octavia Elderglin, who saw things I did not want seen. She had hair the color of polished copper that fell past her hips. She wore cranberry when other women wore cream. She carried a painted fan with ribs shaped like slender bones, and she snapped it shut when she was amused. She had been courting my father's favor in the months since the engagement collapsed. Not, I think, because she wanted my father, but because she wanted the position of being the woman in the room he listened to. She caught me alone in the long corridor that led to the conservatory. She had been waiting, I think. She wore one glove and was drawing the other up her arm slowly as she walked. She did not waste compliments. She tilted her chin 1 degree, which was the gesture before her cruelties. She said,
"Your dog watches me like he knows the weight of my throat."
She let the fan tap once against her palm. She leaned in. She smelled my hair with a small theatrical sniff, the way one tests a perfume one has been told is unsuitable. Her eyebrows lifted.
And you smell of his garden, dear. You should leash him, Agnes, before someone notices.
Laughter would have been the trained response. I had been raised to use it at such moments, to make light of a woman's intelligence, so that she would think her observation cheap and stop using it. My mouth stayed still. I held her eye for a beat too long. She saw something in my face she had not been expecting, and the corner of her mouth lifted, and she lowered the fan, and she walked past me without another word. I saw her once more before she died. It was the next afternoon, in the long gallery, where the windows look out onto the south courtyard. She was speaking to a man I did not know. She saw me at the far end of the gallery. She did not nod. She lifted her fan, snapped it open, and held it across the lower half of her face, the way a woman covers a smile she has decided not to share. Over the painted ribs, her eyes found mine. They were not unkind. They were sorry for me, and not sorry enough to keep silent. That night I told Silas about her. I was at my vanity. He was behind me doing my hair, his gloved hands light at my temples. I told him in the small, bored voice I use for court gossip. I said Octavia had made a joke. I said she had compared him to a dog. His hands did not stop. His expression, I watched it in the mirror, did not change at all. There was no anger. There was no amusement. There was no surprise. There was nothing. His face was the smooth, uninterrupted surface of water under which something very large was sleeping, and the surface did not so much as tremble. That stillness frightened me more than rage would have. I tried to laugh.
I told her that you take excellent care of me.
Yes, my lady.
He set the pin in my hair without looking at it. The next morning, before dawn, Octavia Elderglin was found in the courtyard beneath the south balcony. Her neck was broken, her hands were unmarked. Anyone who has watched a body fall knows what to look for. The scraped palms, the bruised knuckles, the torn fingernails of a woman who reached for the railing on the way down. Octavia had not reached. Her hands lay folded along her sides, as if she had been arranged there. The rain had washed the cranberry from her gown into a wide red stain against the flagstones. The investigator, a man whose name I will not record, because I knew by then what kind of man took a coin from my father, closed the inquiry within a day. Drunken misstep, tragic. The court grieved her for a week. That night I dreamed of her. She was standing in the silver garden in the cranberry gown. Her hair was perfect. Her hands were folded along her sides exactly as they had lain in the courtyard. Where her eyes had been, there were only sockets. Clean, pale, hollow, smooth. She turned her face toward me.
He promised I wouldn't remember. He promised you wouldn't either.
The flowers around her began to release their petals into the air, and as the petals lifted, she lifted with them, dissolving from her hem upward into a slow rising column of white, and the last thing to dissolve was her mouth, and the mouth was smiling. I screamed myself awake, and I was already in his arms. The latch had made no sound. The bolt was still thrown from the inside. I had set it myself. He was sitting on the edge of my bed in his shirt and trousers, no coat, no gloves, and his ungloved hands were against my shoulders, and the silver markings along his wrists were faint and luminous in the candlelight, and his face was very close to mine, and his heartbeat under my cheek when I collapsed against him was too slow. It was too slow, and it was too steady, and it did not change when I sobbed against his shirt.
How did you get in? The door is bolted.
You called for me?
My mouth had shaped a scream, never a name. I kept that truth behind my teeth. I stayed against his chest and let his ungloved hand find the back of my neck, and I felt the silver shimmer of his wrist against my hair. Sleep did not come again that night. I never asked him to leave, and he stayed. He stayed until the sky turned gray. He kept silent. He moved only to settle his palm more carefully against my hair when I shivered. When the first horn sounded from the gatehouse, he rose, and he put on his gloves. and he was gone before the housekeeper came to wake me. There was no sign he had been in the room. There was only the impression of his weight on the edge of my mattress, and the cold spot where his palm had pressed, and the absolute clear memory of an eyeless woman saying, "He promised you wouldn't either." Chapter 8. The Sigil. I went into his chamber the next afternoon while he was at the stables. He kept a small room attached to mine through a service door. I had passed that door 1,000 times without opening it. There is an etiquette in great houses about what a lady may and may not see, and I had observed it more rigidly with him than with anyone, because to look would have been to admit I had wanted to look. I opened the door. The room was very plain. A narrow bed made with the corner folds the army uses, a small wardrobe, a washstand, a wooden chair, a coat hanging from a peg in the wall. The serving key ring at his belt was missing because the belt was there with him at the stables, but a spare ring of small keys hung from a nail beside the door, and beneath that hung a coat, and that was the coat I went to. It was a winter coat, heavy, dark, long. I lifted the hem. I turned the lining toward the light from the high window. The closed eye stared back at me. It was stitched in silver thread, small enough that no one would have seen it from outside, ringed with the same fine line of thorns I had begun to find in every dark corner of my life. It was inside the lining at the breast, where the coat would have lain against his heart. My hands began to shake before my mind reached the conclusion. The body learns faster than the head in this house. I knew before I knew. I lowered the lining. I closed the coat. I stepped back. The wardrobe remained shut, the pillow undisturbed, the keys untouched. I had seen what I needed, and I had been in his chamber long enough. I closed the service door behind me. That evening I went to the archive. The archive of Laura Fay sits in a long, low room above the wine cellar, where it is dry but cold, and where the only window is too high for a man Bernard's size to reach without a ladder. Bernard Sugar had kept the records of our house since my father's father, and his father had kept them before him, and his grandfather before that. He is a thin man with hooded brown eyes and round spectacles, and the second finger of his right hand is stained black from a lifetime of ink. Him whether the household had ever kept records of Fay. He did not look at me. He removed his spectacles and began to clean them on his sleeve.
Once.
He held the lenses up to the lamp. He breathed on them. He cleaned them again.
My grandfather kept a volume. My father did not. I am not, strictly speaking, supposed to know it exists.
I waited. After a long time, he set his spectacles back on his nose, walked to the locked cabinet at the far wall, and produced a brittle book bound in cracked black leather. He set it on the desk between us. He did not open it. He took a step back, as if to indicate that what happened next was mine. I read what I could. The volume was old, and the script was crabbed, and the pages stuck together in places where the damp had won. I read fragments. The two words that came up again and again were cultivation, used in the calm tone one would use of orchids, and devotion, named as the thing the Fae fed on, the way meat feeds a man. I closed the book.
Bernard, has any such servant ever served this house?
Bernard did not look at me. He folded his hands behind his back. He looked at the high window.
Only one, my lady. The same one. Always.
I sat very still. He did not embellish. He did not name the servant. He had not, I noticed, said the word Fae aloud. He never would. I rose. I thanked him. I left. I did not return to my chambers. I went to my mother's old sitting room, which had been closed since I was a child, and which I keep clean myself because I will not allow anyone else to touch it, and I closed the door behind me, and I sat down on the bench at her dressing table, and I lifted the locket out of my collar. I had worn it for 15 years. It was warm from my skin. I turned it in my fingers. I turned it over. The clasp at the back was a small silver disc. I had touched it 10,000 times. I had never, in 15 years, looked at it. I looked at it, a closed eye. Ringed with thorns, I sat with the locket in my palm until the room went dark. My grandmother had put it around my neck on my 12th birthday. She had closed the clasp with both her hands. She had kissed my forehead and said,
Wear this for me.
She had been a Lorifay bride. She had been beautiful. She had died confused in her bed at 51, calling her servant's name, calling Silas, and her sister-in-law had patted her hand and told her to hush, that the servant could not hear her, that no one was there. Silas had been at the foot of the bed. He had been there the whole time. He had stood in his livery, gloved, patient, waiting for her to stop saying his name, and when she had stopped, he had inclined his head, and he had left the room, and the doctor had told the house she had gone in peace. I sat in my mother's chair until I could not feel my legs. I had been wearing his mark for 15 years. I had been wearing his mark for longer than I had been a woman. I did not take the locket off. I put it back inside my collar. I went down to dinner. I ate everything on my plate. I did not look at Silas when he poured my wine, and when he asked, very gently, after the meal, whether I had been to the archive that afternoon, I said yes, I had wanted a record of my grandmother's marriage contract for the lawyers, and there had been nothing useful. His face was smooth and grave and attentive.
I am sorry to hear it, my lady.
I went up the stairs alone. Him, at my door, what he could tell me of his mother, of his birthplace, of the village he claimed to have been born in, when he was assigned to me. What was its name? The village. He answered the birthplace. When I asked him about his mother, he paused, one heartbeat, the pause of a missed step. I saw it land in him.
She is long dead, my lady.
I see. Good night, Silas.
Good night, my lady.
I closed the door. I bolted it. I lit a second candle, not because I needed the light, but because I needed the act of lighting it. I sat on the edge of the bed with the locket in my fist, the closed eye pressed into my palm, and I waited for the imprint of it to bruise. Chapter 9. The Bolted Door. I went to the herbalist in the village the next morning under the pretense of visiting the village seamstress. The herbalist was a woman of 70, with a long gray braid and a workroom that smelled of bitter root and wax. I told her I had been sleeping badly. I told her I wanted something to keep me awake. She gave me a small bottle of black tonic. She said it would hold sleep at bay for 3 days, perhaps 4, and then it would not, and then I would collapse where I stood. She said it was not for women. She said it was for men who guarded mountain roads in winter. She said I should not take it. I bought it. I came back to Lorifay with the tonic in my reticule, and I went up to my chamber, and I bolted the door, and I drew a ring of candles around the bed in a careful circle, and I drank the first measure of the tonic, and I sat down in the chair beside the window with my back very straight, and I waited. Silas came at the usual hour. The handle of the door turned. The door did not open. There was a small pause. Then the handle turned again, more carefully. The door did not open. Through the wood, I heard him stop breathing. I have lived 20 years in his company. I know the rhythm of his breath the way one knows the rhythm of a clock in a room one has slept in for a long time. He stopped breathing. He stood at my door for the length of a slow count of 10. He did not knock. He did not call. He set something, the tea tray, I think, down on the floor outside. And then he did something I have never known him to do. He pressed his palm against the wood. I could not have heard it from a chair across the room. I should not have heard it. But I heard it the way one hears a hand placed against one's own chest. I felt it. The wood vibrated, the candles on the table beside me flickered, all of them at once, as if a breath had passed across the room from the outside in.
Agnes.
He had not in 20 years called me Agnes.
Agnes, please. You will hurt yourself before you hurt me. Please.
I closed my eyes. I did not answer.
Do you miss my mind or my body?
There was a silence.
Do not ask me that while there is wood between us.
I did not open the door. He did not leave. He sat down. I heard the small, slow movement of his weight settling against the wood, and he stayed. Through the long afternoon, through the supper hour, through the evening, he stayed. The household did not interrupt him. No one ever interrupts him. He was the air the house breathed. He could sit against my door for 10 hours, and no one would think to ask what he was doing. The rain began at midnight. I heard it first against the high window. I heard it second hours later, against the courtyard outside, and I knew because I had known since I was 7 what the rain at Lorifet sounded like at the hour just before dawn. I rose from my chair. My legs were shaking from the tonic and from the long sitting. I went to the window. He was no longer at the door. He was in the courtyard below. He was standing in the rain in his shirt, no coat, no gloves, and he was looking up at my window with the same patient orientation a sundial gives the sun. His hair lay flat against his forehead. His lips were not yet blue. I could see, even at that distance, the faint silver of the markings along his wrists, brighter than they ought to have been, as if the rain had washed something thin off his skin to let the truth of him show. He saw me at the window. He did not smile. I closed the curtain. I drank the second measure of the tonic. I drank the third. I stayed awake into the second day, into the third. My mother appeared in the mirror sometime in the night between the second and the third, and I knew she was not there, and I greeted her anyway, and asked her how the brother had taken her death, and she did not answer because she was not there. I heard my own heartbeat in the walls. The candles in the ring began to gutter one by one. I did not relight them. On the fourth dawn, I collapsed. I did not feel the fall. I felt the silver garden. The garden was wrong. The flowers were wilting. The silver had gone the soft green-black of corrosion at the edges of the petals, and the air no longer tasted of cold metal, but of something that had been cold metal once, and had been left out in weather. He was standing among the rows. He was not in his servant's clothes. He was in nothing I had ever seen him wear in the waking world, a loose, pale shirt unbuttoned at the throat, and his pointed ears were visible through his hair, and his silver markings ran from his throat, down into the shirt, and out along his bare wrists, and he was looking at me with the look one looks at a thing one has been forced to break in order to keep. I stepped back. The ground softened under me, grass after frost, and swallowed the force of it. I opened my mouth. He came nearer. His hand reached for my wrist. I jerked away too late. His fingers were already there, had been there longer than my decision to flee. He held me with practiced care, the carefulness of a man who had done this before. I knew in the dream that I had been here before. I felt my mouth shape a word, no, I think, or his name, and I felt him bring his other hand up and lay it against my temple, the way a mother lays her hand against the temple of a fevered child, and I felt the word go out of my mouth before it had been heard. I woke in my bed. The door was still bolted. The candles in the ring had burned out. The black tonic bottle lay on its side, empty. The sun was high. There was a bruise wrapped around my wrist like a bracelet. I lay very still and lifted my arm. 4 small dark prints marked the inside of the wrist where fingers had closed. I lowered my arm. I felt a second bruise high on my thigh where my own hand would not reach in any motion of waking life, and kept my eyes on the wall. Looking would have told me nothing I did not already know. I rose. I unbolted the door. He was outside it, standing, dry. He had changed his shirt, and his eyes went to my wrist, and then away again, immediately, in the deliberate way one refuses to look at the thing one is most aware of. I did not show him the bruise. He did not look at it again. He brought my tea. He did not say anything about the candles, or the bottle, or the rain. He set the tray on the table. He smoothed the cloth. He poured the tea. His gloved hands were steady. I noticed when he set the pot down that his wrists were trembling under the cuffs, finely, the way a leaf trembles in still air. I sat down.
Thank you.
My lady.
He left. I sat with the cup in my hand, and I tried to remember how I had gotten the bruise. I tried, and I could not. I tried to remember whether I had begged him to stop. I tried to remember whether he had stopped. I tried to remember anything at all between the garden and the bed. There was nothing. There was a gap in me the shape of a fight, and I could not put my hand inside it. Chapter 10. The Chapel. There is a chapel at the far end of the estate that the servants will not enter. It is older than the manor. It is older than the family name. It was built into the slope of the orchard hill before there was an orchard, and the orchard had grown up around it the way ivy grows up around a fence post. It has stained glass that has not been replaced in 7 generations. The servants say a smell comes off the stone in winter. The servants say a great many things in this house. I had been told as a child that the chapel was unsafe, that the timbers above the altar were rotted, that I was not to play there, and I had obeyed because there had always been somewhere safer to play, and because Silas had always been the one to bring me back from wherever I went. I went at dusk alone. The door was not locked. The hinges had been oiled recently. Inside, the air was cool. The light through the stained glass fell in patches across the stone floor, in colors I had not expected. Bruise purple, dust blue, sepia where the lead had given out, and the windows themselves were what I noticed first, because I had been told as a child that the windows depicted angels. They did not depict angels. They depicted women. In the leftmost window, a young woman in a high-collared gown lay on her side asleep, and a slender, pale figure with pointed ears bent over her and pressed a closed eye against her brow. In the next, the woman sat upright in bed, hand outstretched, and the figure was at her shoulder, and another closed eye pressed to the place where her temple met her hair. In the next window, the woman was older, and the figure stood behind her at her vanity, and she did not see him, and his closed eye was pressed to the place behind her ear. The fourth woman was very old, and her eyes were vacant, and the figure was tucking her into a bed with the gentleness of a husband and the patience of a gardener. I went down the row. The dresses changed, the hairstyles changed, the women changed. The figure did not. I came to the altar. I knelt. I felt the stones. I found at the second course beneath the altar's western edge a stone that gave when I pressed it. I worked it free. I set it aside. Below it, in a compartment cut into the foundation, were objects. Dried flowers, brown and brittle, tied with thread. Letters in different inks and different hands. Locks of hair in 3 different shades, tied with 3 different ribbons. One ash, one auburn, one a soft pale color I could not look at long. A small wooden box, and at the back of the compartment, wrapped in oiled cloth, a journal bound in pale leather. I lifted the journal out. I sat down on the stone steps, and I unwrapped the oiled cloth, and I opened the journal across my lap, and I began to read. The hand was his. I had seen it on the labels of bottles in the still room, and on the ledger of small household purchases. The hand was his, and the ink had a faint silver shimmer to it when the light caught it the right way, and the entries went back further than my lifetime. Names I had been raised to mourn, names I had been raised never to know. A great-aunt who had drowned at 23. She would not stop asking. She would not be diverted. I was gentle. A maid named Lizette who had threatened to write to the temple. Forgotten. Safe. A tutor of mine when I was 16, whose name I now could not bring up no matter how I reached for it. He let his thumb stay too long on her shoulder. He died in the winter. A cousin. Forgotten. Safe. A line of women and a small line of men in his hand, in his ink, in his judgment of whether they could bear what they had seen. I read the entry for Killian Croilieu. The family hesitated. I did not. I read the entry for Octavia Elderglin. She had begun to suspect. She intended to write to the temple. I could not allow the temple to come for me through her hand. The fall was clean. I read the entries for me. There were many. There were so many. They went back to the year of my birth. She is 1 year old. She turned her face to me before her mother. She is 7. She ordered me into the rain. I would have stood there 1,000 nights. She is 12. The locket has been placed around her throat by the dowager. The bond may be carried in metal. It is. She does not yet know what it is. I have not asked her grandmother to tell her, and her grandmother has not asked me whether to. She is 19. She weeps over a betrothal portrait. I cannot bear to comfort her from the other side of a door. I have entered. She has not seen me. She has felt held. She is 24. She has begun to dread waking. She is 26. She is close to suspecting. She has not yet looked. I turned the page. The next entry was longer than any I had read. The ink had been pressed deeper into the paper. The hand had pressed harder. It was the only entry in the journal he had taken the trouble to date in full. She has found me. She came to the chapel. She read the entries. She read her grandmother's. She read her great-aunt's. She read the maid's. She read her own. She rose from where she was kneeling, and she struck me across the face with the journal. She did it again. I let her. The third time the spine of the book broke against my temple, and I bled into my collar, and I did not raise a hand. She bit my wrist. She bit me hard enough to draw blood, and she begged me, with my blood in her teeth, to let her go. She said, "I do not want to be a woman in a window." She said, "I would rather have hated you cleanly than loved you like this." She said, "Please." She said it 3 times. I held her until she tired. I did not speak. I am not certain I could have spoken. I will take it cleanly. I will be gentler than before. I promise. Erasure. I read the entry through. I read it again. I read it a 3rd time. I could not find myself in it. I had no memory of the chapel, of the striking, of the biting, of the words. The words were mine. I knew them the way one knows the handwriting of a sister, and I could not remember saying them. He had let me forget. He had been gentler than before. The journal said I had a bruise on my wrist for 2 weeks after. I looked down at my wrist. The bruise had faded. The one from 3 nights ago, the one wrapped around my wrist like a bracelet. But I remembered all at once the exact way it had been pressed there. I was pulling away, fighting toward waking. He held me with the gentleness of a man holding a wineglass. He did not want to drop. And I broke anyway, and he cleaned the pieces, and he labeled the entry erasure, and closed the book. I pressed the journal against my chest. I could not remember the fight. I could not remember the screaming. I could not remember what I had said in the moment I had begged him to let me go. But I had. The journal said I had. I sat in the chapel until full dark. Then I rose, and I drew from my pocket the empty ledger I had brought with me. I do not lie to myself any longer about why I had brought it, and I sat back down on the steps with the journal and the ledger across my knees, and by the last gray light through the dust-blue glass I began to copy. I copied the entries that named the dead. I copied the entries that named me. I copied the 8-month entry word for word, and I copied it again, and I made sure my hand could be read. When I was finished, I wrapped the original journal in its oiled cloth, set it back at the bottom of the compartment, and placed beneath it the small leather notebook I had used at 15 to copy out passages of devotional poetry, left blank since, the same shape, the same color, the same weight. If he came to the compartment, he would feel a journal beneath the cloth. He would not feel the difference unless he opened it. He had no reason to open it. He had written it. He knew what it said. I fitted the loose stone back into the altar's edge. I pressed it home with my palm until it sat flush. I went out under my cloak with the copy against my heart, and the orchard was loud with wind, and I walked back to the house with my hand pressed against the leather over my chest. Chapter 11. The Confession in the Garden. He was waiting in my chamber when I came back. He had laid out my nightdress. He had turned down the bed. He had lit the candle on the nightstand. He looked up when I came through the door, and he saw the hem of my cloak still damp at the edge from the orchard wind, and he did not move. The copy stayed hidden. There was no need to show it. He had felt me find what I had found the way I had felt his palm against the wood of the door. I took off the cloak. I hung it carefully, the ledger still in its folds. On the hook he could not see from where he stood. I sat down at the vanity. I unpinned my hair without looking at him in the mirror.
Brush my hair.
He came to me. He took the brush. His hands shook once when he lifted it, and then he steadied them, and he began to brush from the ends upward, the way I had taught him when I was a girl. We watched each other in the mirror. The candle behind us cast a pool of light around our 2 faces and left everything else in the room to the dark.
Silas,
My lady.
have you ever touched me while I slept?
His eyes did not leave mine in the mirror.
Never in the waking world.
That is not an answer clean enough to save you.
He set the brush down on the vanity. His hand stayed on it for a moment longer than it needed to.
No, it is not.
Neither of us looked away. I had never in my life held a man's gaze for as long as I held his that night in the glass.
Go. I will sleep now. I will leave the door unbolted.
He went. He did not bow. He stopped at the door, and his hand was on the frame, and he stood there for a long moment with his back to me. Then he went. I let the candle burn. I lay down on the bed in my dressing gown, and I closed my eyes and I let myself sleep, deliberately, knowing where I was going, knowing he would meet me there. The silver garden was red. The flowers, the ones that had been silver, the ones that had been wilting, were red and heavy now, and they hung from their stems as if the stems would not bear them much longer, and the light off their petals was the color of the inside of a wound. The wrought iron gate stood open. Through it I could see him. He was already on his knees. He was not waiting in the path. He was kneeling at the foot of the gate, with his hands open on his thighs, palms up, and his pointed ears were bare through his hair, and the silver markings ran from his throat down into the open collar of his shirt, and his face was bare of apology, and he was offering me the weapon of himself. I walked through the gate.
You found it. I felt you find it.
Was every dream you?
Yes.
Was every touch real?
He looked up at me. His eyes were ocean blue, and they were very tired.
Real enough to ruin me. Not real enough to be forgiven.
I stepped close. He lowered his forehead against my hip, not against my belly, not against my thigh, against the bone of the hip, like a man laying his head against a wall. I caught his hair in my fist before he could mistake nearness for permission, and I pulled his face up gently, and I held him there.
Confess with your mouth, not your hands.
He did. He was Fae. He had been Fae longer than the kingdom had had a king. He had been bound to Laura Fae by a contract made 6 generations ago by a woman whose name he would not say, who had asked him for something he had not been able to refuse, and the cost of the binding had been that he would serve the daughters of the line until the line failed. He had begun watching me the year I was born. I was the first of the daughters that he had not simply served. I was the first that he had loved. He had entered my dreams the year I was 19, the night I wept over the betrothal portrait, because he could not bear to comfort me only from the other side of a door. He had killed Killian Croilieu when my father had hesitated to dissolve the engagement. He had killed Octavia Elderglin because she had begun to suspect what he was, and she had threatened to write to the temple. He had erased my memory twice. Once when I was 24, when I had climbed onto the parapet of the South Tower in a state I could not remember, and he had taken me down. And once, 8 months ago, in the chapel I had visited that afternoon, when I had found the journal, and I had screamed at him, and I had bitten him hard enough to draw blood, and I had begged him to let me go. He had been gentler than before, all of this on his knees in the red garden with my hand in his hair, and when he was finished he did not look away, he did not embellish, he did not beg, him the question. The question came without planning, the words arrived unchosen. I asked him,
Would I have loved you if you had never touched my dreams?
The silence in the garden was the longest silence I have ever lived inside. The red flowers around us did not move. His breath was very shallow against my hand.
I do not know.
He closed his eyes.
I was not brave enough to find out.
I let go of his hair. He did not raise his head. I stood in front of him until the red garden faded around us, and I woke up in my bed with my hand still half curled in the air, as if I were still holding something I could not put down. The candle on my nightstand had burned down to a stub. The pillow beside mine was smooth. Chapter 12, The Knife and the Terms. I did not sleep again for the rest of the night. I sat up in the bed with the copy at my hip and watched the gray come into the room from the high window. I thought about the temple. I thought about how the temple inquisitors burned Fae alive in the courtyards of the cathedral cities, and how the smoke from a Fae was said to be a color that no other smoke was. I thought about what it would do to my house, to the contracts my father was negotiating, to the lands that had been promised against my marriage, to my brother, to Percival. I had seen him from a corridor window the week before, in his small buttoned jacket holding his practice sword too carefully, and I had stood there long enough to feel my throat close around the knowledge that he was being raised the way I had been raised, and there would be no one to take him down off the tower. I thought about banishing Silas. I thought about the silence of a life in which he was not there to bring the tea before I rang. I thought about who I would be in that silence. I had been built, mortar by mortar, on the foundation of his attention. I did not know whether the woman who emerged from beneath his hand would be able to stand without him. At dawn, I rose. I took the silver letter knife from my writing desk. It was small, ornamental, sharp enough, my grandmother's like everything else, and I crossed the room to the bed where Silas was not, and the chair where Silas was, sitting in the half-light with his eyes closed. He had not slept. He had not pretended to. I pressed the blade against the side of his throat. I pressed it hard enough to draw blood. He did not move. His chin lifted slightly, the way a horse's chin lifts when it accepts the bit, and a thread of red welled along the line of the silver, and a single tear slid from beneath his closed lashes, and did not become a second tear, and did not become anything more. I held the knife there long enough to know I could. I set it down.
Open your eyes.
He opened them.
You will live. I have not decided this for your sake.
No, my lady.
I have copied the journal. The copy is not in this house. It is not anywhere you can reach. If I die, it will be opened. If I disappear, it will be opened. If I forget, if I find I have forgotten the next time we speak of this, it will be opened. The temple will receive it. The house will fall with you.
He nodded once.
These are my terms.
Yes, my lady.
You will not enter my dreams without spoken permission given in daylight. You will not touch my sleeping body. You will not touch my sleeping mind. You will not touch any memory of mine, for any reason, ever again. I will not be made safe through forgetting. You will not use my desire as proof of my consent. You will not kill on my behalf without my knowledge and my spoken word. The word reach is no longer yours to use about me.
He flinched at reach. It was so small a flinch, I would have missed it a year ago. I did not miss it.
Say them back.
Them back. He did not stumble. He did not soften a single clause. He repeated, I will not be made safe through forgetting in his own voice. And the words sat strangely in his mouth, as if he were learning the language of a country he had governed without speaking.
Kneel.
He knelt.
Now ask me what I am leaving you.
He raised his face. He was not crying anymore. He looked at me with the look of a man who has been told he may keep the house, but not the room.
What are you leaving me, my lady?
You may serve me. You may bring my tea. You may dress me in the morning. You may tie the ribbon at my throat. You may stand in the rain if I have asked it. You may want me. You may not do anything about your wanting without my permission, given in my own voice while I am awake.
He bowed his head.
I accept all of it. I have one thing to ask in return.
Ask it.
Tell me to stay. Once. In your own voice. While you are awake. Not now. When you can. When you mean it. That is all I ask.
I did not answer. He had not lifted his head. He did not press for the answer. He waited. After a long time, I crossed to him. I knelt down to him, I, who had not knelt to anyone since my mother's funeral, and I felt my knees touch the floor at the same moment his had been touching it for hours, and I felt the matching of the gesture in me as a thing I had not expected to feel. I took his gloved hand, I turned it, I pushed back the cuff of his sleeve. The silver markings along his wrist were dim that morning, almost gray, the way a fire dims when it has been left untended. I closed his glove over his wrist again. I stood. I told him to rise. He rose.
Bring my tea.
Yes, my lady.
He brought my tea. He brought it later than usual because I had given him time, and because he had needed the time. When he came back, I had not lit the candle. The morning light had come into the room cleanly, and I had washed my face, and I had retied my own ribbon at my throat, crooked on purpose. He set the tray down. He smoothed the cloth. He poured the tea. He did not look at the bed. He never looks at the bed. I turned at the vanity. I held out my wrist, the wrist where the bruise had been, the one that had been there 3 nights and was now gone, and I said,
Kiss it.
He stopped. He did not move toward me. He looked at the wrist. He looked at my face. He was waiting for me to take it back. I did not take it back. He came. He bent. His mouth touched the inside of my wrist with the gentleness of a man who knew he had a single chance and had been told he would not be given another. His glove had slipped at the cuff. The silver markings of his wrist were warm against the underside of my arm, warmer than skin should be, warmer than they had been when the markings were dim, and I felt them flicker faintly into life against me. I pulled my hand away the moment his lips made contact. He did not protest. He straightened. He stood with his hand at his side and his eyes lowered. I waited a moment in the silence for my own decision to settle in me. I held out my wrist again. He bent. He kissed it more slowly. I let him. I let him until I could feel the warmth of his breath on the skin where the bruise had been. And then I drew my hand back, gently this time, because gentleness was a thing I had decided to be capable of. Nothing. He bowed and he left. The room was very quiet. The candle on the nightstand had been unlit since dawn, and I did not light it again. Chapter 13. The Archive and the Threshold. I went back to the archive a week later, Bernard for a volume on the breaking of bonds. The kind required no naming. He removed his spectacles. He cleaned them on his sleeve. He walked to the locked cabinet. He produced a second brittle book, smaller than the first, and set it on the desk between us, and stepped back, and did not say a word. His eyes, as I lifted the book, flickered. They went to my throat. They went specifically to the place at the hollow of my throat where the chain of the locket lay. They came back to my face. He looked at me for one long, unreadable moment, and then he looked down at his hands. He had not said the word Fae aloud. He never would. With that one flicker, he told me he knew. He had known longer than I had. He had been the man at the desk while my grandmother went to the same shelves and turned the same pages, and he had folded the volumes back into the cabinet afterward and not breathed a word, because his grandfather had kept the secret and his father had not. And Bernard, quiet, dry, careful Bernard, with ink on his finger and a pencil tucked behind his ear that he never used in front of me, had inherited the choice, and had not until this moment told me which way he had decided. I understood, looking at him, that he offered no decision, only the fact of his knowledge. What he would do with the knowing was his. I thanked him. I took the volume. I left. I read it in the sitting room that had been my mother's. The volume said what I had already understood. Bonds of the kind I now lived inside broke for no blade. They loosened instead, or were renegotiated, or poisoned slowly through refusal. They held in metal, they held in habit, they held in the air of houses. I closed the volume. On the way upstairs, I passed the long corridor that looks down onto the east garden, and I stopped at the window. Percival was in the garden with the new tutor, a plain woman whose name I had picked from Bernard's list. She was not touching his shoulder. She was standing at a polite distance and pointing to a line in his copybook with the back end of her pen. He was reading it aloud. He stumbled. She waited. He read it again. I stayed at the window until he had finished the page. I went up to my chamber. I did not bolt the door. That was no longer the kind of door I lived behind. I undressed. I lay down. I closed my eyes. I let myself drift. The silver garden came to me, but it came to me only at the edge. I could see the iron gate. I could see the closed eye ringed by thorns. I could see, just beyond the gate, the path. The flowers were a color I had not seen them before, neither silver nor wilting nor red. They were a quiet color, a color like the green of a leaf at evening. He was at the threshold. He had not stepped through. His hands were at his sides. He was not in his servant's clothes, but he was not in the open shirt of the earlier dreams either. He stood in a kind of plain travel coat, as if he had come to a door and stopped, and was waiting for it to be answered. His face held neither impatience nor hurt. He looked the way he had looked at the kitchen flagstones when he was 7 years old, and I had been kneeling in front of him asking him to forgive me for the rain. He was asking permission. I withheld it. Cruelty had nothing to do with it. I did not yet know whether I would have given it without him having asked, and the difference between those two things was the whole reason for the terms. If I let him through tonight, I would not know which of us had opened the door. I woke. I sat up in the bed. The candle on the nightstand was unlit. The wick was straight and cold. I reached for it. I had the flint in my hand. I had the small brass dish ready. I stopped. Lighting it would have felt like permission, not the permission I had spoken in daylight, but the older kind a body gives without a word, the kind a hand performs on its own. I set the flint down. I lay back. I closed my eyes. I lay in the dark in my own bed, for the first time since I was 4 years old, and I did not light the candle. The dark that night did not feel like a room with someone in it. It felt like a room. I slept. Chapter 14. The Laces. A month later, my father announced a second engagement. He told me at the breakfast table. The man was an older lord with a fortress in the north, and 3 sons by a dead wife, and a need for an heir of the proper line. The dowry was set. The contract was nearly drawn. I had been informed, my father told me, as a courtesy. He tapped the head of his cane twice against the floor, and returned to his coffee. I did not eat the rest of my breakfast. I went up to my chamber. Silas was there, brushing the dust from my green walking gown. He looked up. He read my face. He set the brush down. I told him. The Lord's name. The fortress. The names of the 3 sons, memorized in the corridor on the way up the stairs because I had wanted to know them before he did. His hands went very still on the back of the chair. I watched him understand. I watched the small movement, beneath his composure, of the hand he was being told he could not raise.
You will not touch him.
My lady?
You will not touch his family. You will not touch his sons. You will not touch the men who are negotiating the dowry. You will not write anonymous letters. You will not bring me any tea that has ever been in any room with any of them. You will do nothing.
He bowed his head.
What would you have me do, my lady?
Want me without doing anything about it.
He looked up. His face, for the first time I had seen it, had lost its composition. It was bare. The hunger I had watched flicker beneath his stillness across the months was, for that one moment, on the surface of him, and the surface of him could not hold it. He kept silent. Speech would have lessened it. He had been told what to do, and he was doing it. The cost of the doing was on his face. I sat down at the vanity. I turned my back to him. I looked at his face in the mirror. I held out my hand.
Come here.
He came. He stood behind me. He did not look at my reflection. He looked at the back of my head. I took his gloved hand. I turned it. I placed it, palm flat, against the laces at the back of my gown. He stopped breathing.
Untie them.
He did not move. His hand on the laces was rigid, the way a hand is rigid when a man is forcing it not to close.
Is this permission?
His voice was lower than I had heard it.
This is instruction. Permission comes after you obey it.
He closed his eyes. He opened them. He looked at the laces. He untied them. He untied the first one. His hand was shaking. He untied the second more slowly. He untied the third. He untied the fourth. The gown loosened around my shoulders. The fabric of the bodice gave at the back, the small fraction that a loosened gown gives. I felt the air on my shoulder blades. The cuff of his sleeve pulled back as his hand worked the 5th lace, and the silver of his wrist was visible against the green silk, bright now, brighter than it had been at the wrist kiss, as if his obedience were heating it under the skin. I looked at him in the mirror. He had not raised his eyes to the glass. His head was bowed. His hand had stopped at the 5th lace. He was waiting. I let the gown loosen another 1/2 inch. I turned my shoulder, just enough that the line of my collarbone was visible in the mirror. I watched his face. I watched the way he did not look, would not look, at the mirror. My own hand, on the edge of the vanity, was shaking. I had wanted to feel powerful. I felt something closer to grief.
That is all.
He bowed his head a small fraction further. He stepped back. He stepped back exactly the distance he had been before I had taken his hand. I sat at the vanity with the gown loose at my shoulders and looked at myself in the mirror, and I looked at him behind me. The candle on the nightstand was unlit and had been unlit for a month, and behind my own reflection there was only the dim shape of a man who had been instructed and was waiting to be instructed again. I lifted my hands to the laces. I retied them myself, slowly, badly, my fingers stumbling over the work I had let his hands do for 20 years. He did not offer to help. He did not look up. I felt my throat close around the cost of the lesson. I had wanted to know whether I could. I could. The knot at the small of my back sat crooked under my fingers, and I left it crooked, and I did not turn to him to fix it. Chapter 15. The Window. A week later, the contract from the fortress in the north was withdrawn. It came back unsigned. A letter accompanied it. The old lord's eldest son had taken sudden ill. Nothing fatal, the letter assured my father, only a long fever that would keep him from court, and the family had decided to bring forward a marriage for the son's own household first, which would require the dowry funds the father had intended for himself. The old lord regretted. He sent compliments. My father read the letter through twice. He tapped the head of his cane twice against the floor. He did not say anything to me. I went up to my chamber after the noon meal. I shut the door. I sat down on the edge of the bed, and I did not move for a long time. Then I rang the bell. Silas came. He stood inside the doorway. He did not look at me. He was waiting for the question.
Did you do anything?
He raised his eyes to mine. His gaze held steady. The answer did not soften.
No, my lady.
Did you cause the son's fever?
No.
Did you speak to anyone in that house through any dream of theirs?
No.
Did you stand near anyone in that house in a way that turned their air?
No.
Did you do anything at all?
No.
I sat with the answer. I held it in my hand the way I had held the silver petal, the way I had held the wax eye. It was light. It did not melt. It did not warm. I could not tell whether to believe him. That, I think, was the cost he had agreed to pay, that I would have to live with not knowing, and he would have to live with being unbelieved, and neither of us would be released from the loop of it, and the leash would hold both of us by holding the doubt itself.
Thank you, Silas.
My lady.
He inclined his head, and he left. It is summer at Lorifay now. The orchard is heavy. Percival has been moved into his own rooms in the east wing, and the plain tutor reads with him in the garden in the long afternoons. The tutor does not touch his shoulder. I watch her do it from the corridor. I stand at my window at dawn most mornings now. This morning, when I rose, Silas was in the garden below. He was no longer pretending to prune the hedges. He has stopped pretending many things. He stood in the gravel path, in the same place where the boy had stood in the rain, and he looked up at my window, and he waited. He did not smile. He did not bow. He waited. I stood at the window for a long time. I felt the locket at my throat. I felt the place at my cheekbone where the mark used to be powdered, and where for some weeks now I have left the powder off. I felt the morning air come through the open pane. I raised my hand. I raised it for him to see. An acknowledgement no larger than the smallest gesture a hand can make and still mean something. And I lowered it. He inclined his head a fraction. He turned. He went. I stayed at the window an hour after he had stopped looking up. That night I closed my eyes. The candle on the nightstand was unlit. The pillow beside mine was smooth. The dark in the room did not feel like a room with someone in it. It felt, for the first time in my life, like a room with me in it. I slept. The garden came to me, changed beyond silver, beyond red, a wilder thing now. The flowers were of no color I could name. They grew in directions they had not been planted in. The wrought iron gate was still there, but it had opened of its own slow rust, and beyond it the path was overgrown enough that I had to step carefully. I walked alone. I walked until I came to a place where the path turned, and behind me, in the brush, I heard a footstep. I turned. He was there. He was at the edge of the garden, just outside the iron gate, in the plain travel coat. His hands were at his sides. He did not step forward. He looked at me the way he had looked up at me at the window, and he waited. I considered him. I considered the boy in the kitchen. I considered the gloves. I considered the silver petal in the jewelry box, and the wax eye in the locked drawer. I considered Killian's gray lips and Octavia's folded hands. I considered the chapel and the journal, and the screaming I could not remember, and the bruise on my wrist that had finally fully faded. I considered that I had not said stay. I did not say it now. I took a long breath. I extended my hand, not a summons, not a word, a choice, made in the garden I walk in alone, made by the hand that belongs to me. He stepped to the edge of the gate. He did not cross it. He reached slowly, and his fingers touched mine, gloved still, even here, because that is what he is now, what I have made him. And he waited again, with his fingertips against mine, for the next thing I would decide. I did not decide it yet. I let our hands rest there, just at the threshold, neither of us pulling closer and neither of us pulling away. In the waking world, in my bed, in the dark of my own room, my hand was open on the smooth pillow beside mine. The candle was unlit. I was the one waiting in the dark.
I hope I kept you company with my story. It would mean so much for you to like and subscribe because it helps me make more. I'll see you in the next one.